Lord of the Oasis. Chapter 271, A Reminder from the Desert Bandits. As night fell, the stars in the sky shone brightly. The scorching temperature during the day had already dropped. Now that the temperature had suddenly dropped, it was a good time for them to trudge through the desert. As long as they could set up their tents and raise bonfires before the cold night arrived, they would be safe. That was one of the reasons why the trade caravan left in a hurry and reported the situation as soon as possible. But there were more reasons. It was because they were afraid that Rolf would go back on his words and lead a group to rob them. Just a few days ago, there was a rumor that the trade caravan that offended Rolf was attacked by bandits after leaving the post house. They died in the desert where it was half a day away from the post house and the stone pass. As night fell, the stars in the sky shone brightly. The scorching temperature during the day had already dropped. Now that the temperature had suddenly dropped, it was a good time for them to trudge through the desert. As long as they could set up their tents and raise bonfires before the cold night arrived, they would be safe. That was one of the reasons why the trade caravan left in a hurry and reported the situation as soon as possible. But there were more reasons. It was because they were afraid that Rolf would go back on his words and lead a group to rob them. Just a few days ago, there was a rumor that the trade caravan that offended Rolf was attacked by bandits after leaving the post house. They died in the desert where it was half a day away from the post house and the stone pass. Everyone's throats were cut to death. The head of the merchant who offended Rolf was stuck in a spear. Although no one could prove that Rolf was the one who did it. But everyone understood that it was this bandit-like guy who planned the attack in the dark. Rolf could do it. He had a bad reputation in the continent of Caradia. He was different from the NPCs of the good faction like Firentis, Boonduk, James, and Manad. He was a complete scoundrel and a scumbag. There was nothing that he wouldn't do. The bottom line for him was a layer of membrane that he could break through at any time. Just like a woman. However, Rolf was extremely loyal to Kant. In other words, the NPCs of the evil faction were all blindly loyal to Kant and unconditionally supported him. They did not oppose Kant's good deeds and welcomed Kant's evil deeds more. They had no objections to this. Compared to the good faction like Boonduk and Firentis, the evil faction was undoubtedly more suitable for the development during the initial expansion. After all, the process of accumulating the initial funds was all about bloody slaughter, and good people could only be oppressed. This was the truth of the world. When one did not obtain the corresponding strength, the so-called good could only be swallowed up by other fierce competitors. It was like fish and shrimp in a lake, devouring each other's growth and plundering each other's resources. Therefore, Kant trusted Rolf very much, and similarly gave him great power. Just in terms of military power. Other than Firentis, who was in charge of Trondheim Castle, Rolf's military power was the most important. Kant believed that Rolf could solve the problem for him. Rolf was very good at this kind of dirty work with blood on his hands. Not only could he suppress the restless situation that the post house was facing, but he could also use the scimitar in his hands and the spears of the cavalries behind him to deal with it perfectly. Everyone would be afraid. Anyone would maintain their flattery in front of a butcher's knife and learn to bend down and flatter. Those merchants from the dukedom of Leo, who had ulterior motives and each had a noble background, would also learn how to offer their humbleness to Rolf. They would pay a lot of great silver coins, which was just happened to be on their bottom line, in exchange for permission to access here safely. Even if some people were unwilling to give up and bring a bandit gang, causing a riot, for Rolf who was already on guard, as long as he was careful, it would be an easy counter-ambush. At night, Kant and Rolf had a deep discussion about the future garrison issues. The focus was on any dangers they might encounter in the future, as well as the reactions of the noble families. Rolf needed to remain vigilant. They chatted until late into the night. If Kant did not have to set off for the Oasis lookout the next morning, they would probably have to continue chatting. After all, this central post house, which was located at the Oasis lookout, the Stone Pass, and even the mountain pass of the Seenway range, was Kant's only window to communicate with the outside world. The various problems and pressures he faced immediately came upon. Rolf's burden was very heavy. But because of this, Kant chose to believe in him. Rolf, who came from the continent of Karadia and had gone through training, he naturally had outstanding abilities. The night deepened. Bright starlight filled the sky. The merchants had all replenished their water and food, and left in the direction of the stone pass. Kant and Rolf's discussion ended. The accompanying Swadian knights also entered their rooms to rest. After all, they had to set off at dawn tomorrow. It was estimated that there was still a day and a night's journey before they could return to Oasis Lookout. It was a long journey, and in the harsh environment of the Naran Desert, it was indeed a tiring journey. Because of this, the post-house soldiers gave their rooms to Kant and the others to sleep in. The night passed without a word. The chill descended on the desert. However, bonfires were lit inside and outside the post-house. The warmth dispelled the coldness, allowing the knights in the room and the cavalries in the tents outside to sleep peacefully. The desert bandits who patrolled the night, they wore thick leather robes made from the fur of the sand gazelle, which kept them very warm. As the stars shone brightly in the sky, the faint chill became more and more intense. Late night arrived. The night duty cavalries changed their shifts a few times. The dazzling starlight and the bright moonlight shone on the ground as if it was covered with layers of muslin. Behind the surrounding dune, where even the patrolling desert bandits could not reach, a team of cavalry appeared. There were about 10 of them, and they were also wearing leather robes. Their entire bodies were wrapped inside, only exposing their nostrils and eyes. As they breathed, white mist with hot air spewed out, and their eyes were cold. They did not say much. They were still extremely unaccustomed to the harsh environment of the Naran Desert. They turned their horses around and galloped. The horses, who were already exhausted, stepped on the dune, snorted, and ran deeper into the dune. The night was silent. The light of dawn pierced through the darkness, and the twilight at the end of the horizon proved that the day had arrived. However, the dawn of the Naran Desert was still cold. A slight breeze from the north blew past his face, and he could still feel the freezing chill. The temperature of the desert varied greatly between day and night. The high temperature during the day could boil water, and the low temperature at night could freeze it. This was the reason why the Naran Desert was called a forbidden area for humans. No one wanted to live here. Even Kant felt a sense of helplessness towards this desert. If one could live on a fertile plain, no one would willing to survive in such a harsh environment. At the well next to the post house, the clear and cool water from the underground lake had been lifted up by a wooden bucket. Fortunately, a fish from the underground lake was caught in the wooden bucket. The carp, which was as wide as a palm and as long as a forearm, was sent directly to the kitchen and became part of the breakfast. There were fish living in the underground lake that was connected to the well. Although there were not many of them, there were still quite a number of them. But now was not the time to care about this. The clear and cool lake water had filled up everyone's water sack. The high-quality feed that was sent from the Oasis Lookout was used to feed the Swadian Knights' war horses. Everything was well prepared. In the kitchen, the breakfast was also finished. In front of Kant was oatmeal, toast, dried meat, fried fish, and eggs, and a small cup of malt wine as appetizer. Although it seemed simple, it was a sumptuous meal in the post house. The others only ate oatmeal, toast, and dried meat. Everyone swallowed down their food. They had to wait for the sky to turn bright, and they had to take advantage of the fact that the temperature was not completely scorching right now. If they waited for the scorching sun at noon, it would be much more difficult for them to continue trekking in the desert. After breakfast, Kant gave Rolf a few instructions and left with his team. The 103 Swadian Knights followed closely. The tracks left by the camel caravans when they were transporting supplies were the roads. Although they had been through a sandstorm, there were still camel caravans that had brought supplies to the post house recently. The tracks could be seen clearly. However, traces of horse hooves and ruts could occasionally be found. Kant raised his head and looked at the dune on both sides. There were some broken carriages left there, and there were also scattered corpses. There were even some whose heads had been chopped off and inserted into the spear. They were raised diagonally, like primitive and ancient totem pillars, intimidating the travelers who dared to set foot on this road. This was indeed a threat. It came from Rolf's unscrupulous killing. Kant recognized that the carriage and the corpses were all merchants from the dukedom of Leo. They had been killed only a few days ago. It should have been after the sandstorm. It seemed that these merchants were trying to take advantage of the chaos after the sandstorm to enter the Oasis lookout. However, they were discovered by the desert bandits. Rolf directly killed them, slaughtering the group of people who dared to violate the rules between the dune. Even their heads were hung on the spear, intimidating those who came later. But obviously, this deterrence was not effective. On both sides of the dune, there were scattered corpses. They were either dressed as merchants or adventurers. But without exception, they were all found by the patrolling desert bandits. They chopped off their heads and stuck their long sword or spear into the top of the dune. They looked at the road in a miserable manner, still intimidating those who came later. The desert bandits had no objection to this. It was just killing a few people. When they were in the Sarand desert, they had done all kinds of evil. Otherwise, they wouldn't be called desert bandits. Kant led the knights and sped forward, and the number of corpses between the dune on both sides gradually decreased. It could be seen that there were too few people who could resist the threat of death and still wanted to enter the depths of the Naran desert. Especially with so many corpses on both sides, it completely showed the ruthlessness of the cavalry. To lose their lives for the sake of intelligence, this transaction was not worthy at the moment. Kant and the others were galloping. But behind them, there were 5 desert bandits who quickly rode their horses over. "Slow down," Kant raised his hand to signal. The advancing speed of the team immediately slowed down, allowing the small team of desert bandits to follow. The leading desert bandits were panting, obviously galloping all the way. When they saw Kant and the others stop, they immediately rode their horses to Kant's side. They quickly reported, "My lord, our patrol team has discovered abnormal footprints on the dune. There may be spies deep in the desert. Rolf told me to inform you to pay attention to your safety." "Yes, I understand," Kant nodded, his eyes calm. It was very easy to find abnormal footprints in the desert. After all, if there was no wind and no sandstorms, the footprints between the layers of sand could be clearly seen within a few weeks. It was because of this that Rolf was able to lead the desert bandits and Sarandian horsemen to easily discover whether there were any spies or merchants who violated the prohibition and entered the depths of the desert. Capturing them was also simple. As long as they followed the footprints, they could capture these little mice. "How many are there?" Kant asked. Chapter 272, The Title of Royal Knight. According to the traces, there are 10 horses. Desert bandits replied, but the exact number of people is unknown. It is estimated that there are no more than 10 people. Kant said, "That might be 10 horses and 10 riders." "Yes," desert bandits nodded. They still reminded him, "We did not find any traces of a bonfire. It is estimated that it was a long journey. However, it is worth noting that there are no traces of a bonfire or a campsite at all. Therefore, Lord Rolf plans to personally lead a team to chase after them later. He specially sent me to remind Lord Kant to be more vigilant so as to avoid danger." If that's the case, Kant narrowed his eyes. He did not find any traces of bonfires or camping sites, and it was a long journey. If they were the natives without the support of the system, he really needed to pay attention to it. No wonder Rolf had specially sent the desert bandits to warn him. It was indeed strange. However, Kant's expression was calm. With 103 top-tier Swadian knights by his side, any danger could be resisted. "Then we'll leave." After passing on the information, the desert bandits turned their horses around and left. "My lord, please be careful. Kant nodded. Lightly knocking on the horse's abdomen, the military horse under him moved forward. He led the team forward. However, he suddenly felt a little uneasy. How could an ordinary spy or rider defend against 103 top-tier, peak knight-level Swadian knights? This was simply impossible. Even if it was a terrifying savage demonized creature, it would probably die on the spot. After all, these knights' combat skills and battle experience were real. Kant had some doubts about his own uneasiness. The source was very simple. According to the desert bandits, there were no signs of bonfires or camping sites. It seemed that they were rushing all the way without rest. An ordinary person can't do this. Kant couldn't help but mutter to himself. Even his troops couldn't do this. Although he had the support of the system, he still needed to rest and avoid the scorching sun and the freezing cold. After all, they were flesh and blood, and the war horses under them were the same. If that unknown group was really trekking day and night without the fear of the cold and the heat, it would be too terrifying, and he could not help but be vigilant. Subconsciously, he held the hilt of the sword by his waist, and the sword of the king released a power that made him feel at ease. However, a dialogue box suddenly popped up on his retina. Ding side quest issued. Side quest, Terrifying Attacker. Reward, 5,000 reputation. Introduction, you are facing terrifying attackers, who were lurking on the road you must pass. After receiving the information, you plan to play along and annihilate the attacker in this desert. However, due to the terrifying strength of the attackers, you might need a royal knight with extraordinary strength. It would be more appropriate. The system notification box appeared. Kant narrowed his eyes slightly. This notification had exceeded his expectations. He exhaled slightly. Looking at the undulating dune, he immediately understood that his uneasiness was real. I actually need to level up to a royal knight in order to deal with this group of attackers. This meant that the attackers were enemies with extraordinary strengths. Even the system had to warn them as soon as possible. Kant gripped the sword of the king in his hand tightly and said in a deep voice, "Stop moving forward. Stop moving forward." The captain of the knights spoke one after another to convey Kant's orders. All the Swadian knights immediately reined in their reins and stopped moving forward. "I need 33 people." Kant ordered them in a low voice, those with outstanding battle achievements, who thinks that they are qualified. Then get off your horses and step out. I will confer him the title of Royal Knight. The situation was urgent. Kant did not intend to deal with it in a complicated manner. There was a slight commotion among the knights. As they conversed with each other, they had their own candidates in their hearts. Soon, the 33 Swadian knights with outstanding battle achievements, who had received everyone's approval, got off their horses and walked out quickly. They stood in a straight line and looked at Kant with a determined expression. Their eyes were filled with excitement and fanaticism. If becoming a knight was the dream of any Swadian heavy cavalry, then becoming a royal knight was the dream of any knight. The title had the word royal added. However, their status, and honor were all different. They were all symbols of higher honor. This was the highest honor that the kingdom of Swadia on the continent of Karadia had never had before. It made these knights' emotions surge. Even those knights behind them who did not have outstanding battle achievements were also looking at Kant with eager eyes. Their eyes were filled with incomparable fanaticism as they became more and more excited about the future. This was an affirmation for them. As long as they worked hard under Lord Kant, they would obtain the highest honor. Becoming this respectable royal knight would no longer be a dream. Kant dismounted his horse and came in front of the 33 Swadian knights. He slowly walked past them. "You have outstanding battle achievements. You are the outstanding ones that everyone recognizes." Kant looked at them and placed his right hand on the hilt of the sword of the king. He said in a deep voice, "Now, do all of you choose to take on more responsibilities and fight for me on this land?" "We are willing to." The 33 Swadian knights replied in unison. Everyone knelt down on one knee at the same time. They lowered their heads towards Kant and said with incomparable devotion, "We will give everything and honor to you. We will fight for you and swear on this land that you belong to." "Very good." Kant stretched out his hand and pulled out the sword of the king. The body of the sword was also decorated with simple yet imposing gold patterns. According to the system's notification, he placed the tip of the sword on the shoulders of the 33 Swadian knights and announced in a deep voice, "Now, I will bestow you with the title of Swadian Royal Knight." The gold patterns on the body of the sword instantly lit up. A gentle yet inviolable aura instantly erupted. The 33 Swadian knights' bodies also erupted with golden light. A dense stream of data simultaneously appeared in front of Kant, enveloping all of the Swadian knights. A heart-palpitating fluctuation spread out through the stream of data. This included the military horses owned by the 33 Swadian knights not far away. Ding system prompt. You have conferred 33 knights as royal knights. A total of 3,300 reputation points have been consumed. The system dialog box popped up on his retina. The data stream immediately dispersed. Amidst the dazzling golden light, the figures of the 33 knights appeared. Fully clad plate armor was worn on their body, and it was polished until it was smooth and translucent. Even though it was covered in a linen coat, it was still shining silver under the sunlight, and there were exquisite patterns carved on it. It was so beautiful that it was like they were not the knights who had been on the battlefield for a long time. Instead, it was a work of art meticulously crafted by the artist. It was the most perfect war art. The 3 meters long heavy armor-piercing lance was held in one arm. The kite shield on the left arm was inlaid with fine steel. Behind the fluttering light blue cloak, the gilded knight sword was pinned on the left waist. There was also a slender spiked warhammer hanging on the right side. At the top of the heavy armor-piercing lance, a small triangular flag was fluttering. It was the red-bottomed golden lion that symbolized Kant. In the crowd, 33 Swadian war horses that were also clad in plate armor came over. They were also clad in linen robes. The exquisite patterns on the stirrups and saddles were extremely delicate. It was like they had took a big leap. The Swadian knights that was once clad in double-layered heavy chain armor was powerful enough. But now, when they faced with the full body plate armor of the Swadian royal knights, they were like country bumpkins in the countryside. There was no comparison at all. Especially the imposing manner of these royal knights, it was even more shocking. "Greetings, Lord Kant." Even the war horses beside them lowered its head slightly, as if they were very intelligent. "Very good." Kant revealed a smile, raising his hand and saying, "Get up." "Thank you, Lord Kant." The 33 royal knights nodded and stood up again. Their trump card auras were like the wind, blowing towards them. They were indeed Kant's true trump card troops. Kant had never thought that after being promoted to a royal knight and becoming a level 6 troop class, there would actually be an earth-shattering change. As for the extraordinary strength that Kant had speculated, these royal knights had indeed grasped it. And they had mastered it very comprehensively. Swadian royal knights, level 6 heavy cavalry, knights who have been cleansed by the power of a king, the royal knights who are invincible on the battlefield, are the nightmares of any enemy. Talent: 1. King's power. They have a special power that can increase their physical attributes by 200%. 2. Kings intimidate. The power they control can be externally, causing a spiritual pressure on the enemy. 3. Kings courageous. They can enter the fearless state. 500% buff of all physical attributes can be unleashed. During the stage, they can be completely immune to low morale. The system had already given out the interface of the troop class. There was only an introduction of the Swadian knights. As for talents and the like, there was none at all. As for the royal knights, the 3 talents that appeared seemed to be the manifestation of magical strength, more like those grand knights who truly possessed magical strength, the strength that could easily defeat the strength of an ordinary troop class. Just by relying on the 33 Swadian royal knights, Kant could not help but feel his emotions fluctuate after comparing them with the ordinary knights. Ordinary knights would not be able to shake these royal knights at all. If one royal knight wanted to, it would definitely be no problem for him to defeat 10 ordinary knights. It was just like how a grand knight could crush an ordinary knight. This was because he had grasped the magical strength, the talents in the attribute interface of these royal knights. It was the same as having the strength to stand on the rules of the world. They could unleash their full strength at any time, recover at any time, and beat ordinary knights to the ground at any time. Even the peak knight level could not compare to a grand knight who had just grasped magical strength. The reason was clear. Kant slightly clenched his fist, and his gaze towards these royal knights became even more fervent. No wonder grand knights were the trump cards of the battlefield. There were 33 grand knight level royal knights appearing on the battlefield. They were wearing full body plate armor that was at the peak of the era of cold weapons. Even their war horses were also wearing full body plate armor. What troop could be their opponent? It was estimated that at the moment of the fighting, the other troops would be scattered into pieces. 10 extraordinary strength attackers. Kant looked ahead and revealed a mocking smile. Then what can you do with the counter-ambush of 33 royal knights with extraordinary strength and 70 knights at the peak of knight level? Chapter 273, The Infighting Intruders. In the middle of the rolling dune, 10 mysterious men who were completely covered in leather robes and hoods were waiting quietly. The 10 horses behind them stood like puppets, their eyes were lifeless and extremely tired. Finally, a mysterious man with a hood on his head spoke. His tone was a little anxious. The spell won't last long. If we can't finish Kant in the next 12 hours, I suggest we retreat immediately. Otherwise, we'll have to walk out of this damn desert on 2 legs. That's your problem, the mysterious man said in an indifferent tone. You're in charge of the horse. If there's a problem, it's naturally your responsibility. I hope you can be mentally prepared. Oh, damn it! The mysterious man at the back was enraged and raised the staff in his hand. Don't think that I'm afraid of you, he said in an angry voice. You have to know that if it weren't for someone paying a high price, with my status, I would be drinking the best black tea in the Mage Tower and enjoying delicious desserts. This is the rule of your life. There's no need to say more. The leading mysterious man was not afraid at all. His tone was still indifferent as he said calmly, but if something goes wrong, you will also pay the price. You are threatening me. The man narrowed his eyes and raised the magic staff inlaid with gemstones. Threatening? No, you have misunderstood. I am just telling the truth. The leading mysterious man did not seem to have noticed the elemental power in the air. He spoke indifferently. There are many mages in the Mage Tower. My master has paid a price to invite you, so you have to show your corresponding value. He paused and slowly turned his head. He looked at the mysterious man at the back indifferently. Also, shut your whining mouth, or you won't be able to return to your Mage Tower alive. You, the mysterious man at the back gritted his teeth. At the tip of the magic staff in his hand, a dark red light was illuminated within the gem. It was like a raging flame contained within it, ready to explode with a terrifying blazing flame at any time. But in the end, he did not release it. He snorted coldly and lowered his magic staff in extreme indignation. He stood at the back with a cold face and did not say anything else. However, the atmosphere in the team had calmed down. The leading mysterious man looked calm, but there was a hint of mockery in his eyes. In the Mage Tower, the mages who lived a good life and liked to study magic, who fought on the battlefield and trained hard in the training ground day and night to obtain an excellent physique, were even stronger in close combat. That's right, he was the Grand Knight who had mastered the mysterious magical strength. Within a range of less than 3 meters. Even if this mysterious fire mage was the first to cast a spell at him, he could still survive. Because he could move in an instant in such a short distance. He could draw his sword and easily killed this mage who overestimated himself and looked down on everything. It was very easy for him. However, he still needed the help of this mage to take care of the next mission. Including the other 8 mysterious people behind him, they were all desperados and powerhouses that were recruited by their master with a huge amount of money and cost, all for the purpose of killing Baron Kant, who was about to pass by this road and was protected by many elite cavalries. It was a mission that only allowed success, not failure. If not for this reason, he would have easily killed this mage. After all, in close combat, even a high-level mage would not be a match for an ordinary Grand Knight like him. The others looked on coldly. They were gathered together because of benefits. To be honest, even for this mission, they felt that they were overqualified and could easily complete it. It was just killing a small noble. And it was the least favorite son of the Duke, who was exiled in the desert and was known well throughout the country. Baron Kant. If they killed this Baron and acted carefully, they would probably not be wanted. Perhaps burying his body in the desert would make it hard for others to figure out whether this Baron was hiding his identity and escaping from the cruel environment of the Naran Desert, or was he really killed by someone. Right now, the public opinion of the Dukedom of Leo was all about this Baron Kant, when he died in the Naran Desert and when he escaped from the Naran Desert. As for the so-called development in the desert, it was really laughable joke. Could the Naran Desert, this damned place, still be developed? Oh, a salt mine was discovered. But even if this salt mine existed, it was not something that the exiled Baron could set foot in. Therefore, they all stood there quietly and waited. They looked at the path that the camel's footprints had made outside the dune. They understood that Kant's team was about to arrive. They felt relaxed about this. There were also people who turned their heads to look at the barren desert in boredom. They felt that the temperature was getting hotter as the sun appeared. When they felt the temperature was rising as compared to the cold winter at night, they felt even more relieved that they did not fall into this environment to survive. Just like what the people described about the Naran Desert, it was truly as terrifying as hell. The mysterious person in the lead also sighed in his heart. It was such a place that actually had salt mines. The fine white salt produced there was no less than the high-quality white salt purchased from the Dwarf Kingdom. The profits was tempting, and greed rose in his heart. That was why the master behind him made this choice. He commanded them remotely to kill Kant, who was with the title of Lord. When that time came, the chaotic situation would be beneficial for the Lord behind him to enter this desert and seize that salt mine. Narrowing his eyes slightly, the mysterious Grand Knight raised his head. On the dune in the distance, groups of black dots appeared. They were galloping on the undulating dune under the sunlight. Occasionally, there were a few pieces of shiny colors flashing over. It seemed that the polished armor was reflecting the sunlight. "They're here," he said in a deep voice. His hand was already reached deep into his linen robe. He held the long sword that he carried with him. "Everyone, I think you all understand your mission." "Of course." A reply came from behind, including the cold snort of the mysterious mage at the back. But no one cared about that now. They slowly moved back and rode on the back of the horses with dull eyes full of bloodshot, and looked extremely tired, but still full of energy. They circled around the dune and laid in ambush, ready to launch a sudden attack. Their plan was very perfect. In fact, if it were anyone else, they would have stepped into this trap. Kant was different. He had already received the warning from the system. Along the way, not only him, but even the 33 Swadian royal knights behind him and the remaining 70 Swadian knights were all alert as they observed the front, the 2 wings, and the rear with extreme vigilance. When they crossed the dune under their feet and officially entered the dune area with a more complicated and continuous environment, the royal knights who had enhanced their eyesight and could see very far instantly discovered that the 10 mysterious men were riding on horses and planned to move behind the dune. They immediately reported, "Lord Kant, if my guess is correct, those people are the attackers." The captain of the Royal Knights spoke. In a short period of time, they had been divided into 3 standard combat teams of 11 people in each team. This formation was convenient for commanding. At the same time, when they faced the enemy, they could attack separately and break through in a concentrated manner. This could be considered the traditional routine of the heavy cavalry. As experienced and top-tier heavy cavalry, these royal knights naturally had excellent combat skills. For example, they formed their own teams and protected Lord Kent during wartime. These were all actions that needed to be taken. "All right," Kent nodded. He also saw the black shadow that disappeared from the dune in the distance. However, with his knight body, he could still see them vaguely from afar. It was only because he was on high alert and focused on the terrain in front of him that he was able to notice them. Otherwise, he would definitely not be able to notice them if he looked at it casually. Since he noticed them now, he could react now. The heavy cavalries that Kent was leading were all elites. The royal knights were the elites of the elites. The possessors of magical strength. 3 teams of royal knights each brought 2 teams of knights and slowly dispersed in the desert. The hooves of the warhorse heavily trampled on the sand layer. However, due to the softness of the sand layer and the support of the system, it would not completely sink into the hooves of the warhorse. Therefore, the sound of the warhorse galloping was very soft. Although it could not take advantage of the speed advantage of the plains and the stone roads. However, the concealment ability was greatly increased. If it was the plains or the stone roads, the booming sounds would have long shook the eardrums and resounded throughout the sky. Kent personally led 10 knights forward. Their speed remained unchanged, they were still not being noticed by the attackers. However, outside the 2 sides of the dune, the speed of the royal knights and knights who surrounded them in the long dragon formation was even faster. The 33 royal knights were like long lances, easily riding their horses to attack the dune. The military horses under them seemed to possess a mysterious power, and they were extremely fast when they stepped on the sand. They were a distance away from the ordinary knights, and reached the predetermined encirclement in the shortest time possible. Kent and the others had only traveled half the distance. The distance between 2 sides was getting closer. The royal knights and knights who had entered the anti-ambush location also began to move forward quietly in the dune. Everyone was making preparations, including the mysterious attackers behind the dune. They were very sure that the cavalries that they had seen and the intelligence they had received should have a large number of cavalries protecting Kent. It was definitely different from the current 11 people. The number was pitifully small. Some astonishment appeared in everyone's hearts. But as Kent approached, they suppressed the astonishment in their hearts. They were just ordinary heavy cavalries. Perhaps they were at the level of knights, but with just the 10 people here who possessed the magical strength, as long as they were careful, they would be able to exterminate this group of cavalries in a minute. This was not arrogance, but the confidence of their strength. However, at the end, the mysterious mage holding a magic staff in his hand had hatred in his eyes under the mask. As he swept his gaze across the group of cavalries in front of him, he felt even more humiliated in his heart. He suddenly had a method that could perfectly complete the mission and also secretly solve his own trouble. Fire elements jumped around at his fingertips. The expert-level fire arrow was ready. If the opportunity allowed, he would pretend to make a careless mistake and shot the spell that could pierce through armor and explode the human body towards the behind of the magical knight in the lead. If he offended a noble mage, he would receive the punishment he deserved. Chapter 274, The Jaw-Dropping Shock. Kent led the team forward. The hooves of the horses hit the sand layer, making a slight poof-poof sound. Everyone moved forward at a constant speed, getting closer and closer to the dune in front of the attackers. However, as if they had not sensed any danger, they still let their warhorse gallop forward, as if they were traveling on their usual journey. Kent, who was leading the team in front, looked calm. As for the 10 Swadian knights' helmets behind them, they were full helmets. Their helmets looked like buckets and their heads were buckled inside. Only a narrow eye hole revealed their eyes, and there was a fine mesh of holes between their noses and mouths that allowed them to breathe. It was impossible to observe their facial expressions. Therefore, they could remain vigilant at all times and observe the enemies in front of them through the eye hole. Although the eyehole's vision was limited, it was not a problem for them to focus on a certain area and observe it carefully. For example, at the back of the dune in front of them, they held the lances in their hands tightly as they got closer and were ready to charge at any time, or they could pull out the warhammer at their waists and engage in close combat. They had to make sure that Lord Kant would not be threatened. Even if they were to be in danger or even die in battle, they had to ensure the safety of their lord, the Supreme Kant. For example, they had already seen a flash of red light that suddenly appeared in front of them. Danger! The Swadian knights immediately spread out to both sides. The knights on both sides of Kant immediately raised their kite shields and urged their horses to block between the red light and Kant. Their faces under the huge helmets were resolute and did not show the slightest fear. Protect Lord Kant! They all let out furious roars. The others also ran around Kant. They were afraid that other than the red light that was shooting at them at an extremely fast speed, there would be other abnormal situations. Fortunately, there weren't any. The red light instantly touched the ground. The scorching aura was like a storm, whistling and raising raging flames. Within a range of 5 times 20 meters, a wall of raging flames that obstructed their advance instantly surged up. Kant stopped his warhorse and faced the incoming heat wave, gritting his teeth slightly. It was an extraordinary spell. The raging flames rose up, burning up to a height of more than 3 meters. The heat wave spread around the 20-meter-long wall of flames. Kant and the others, who were 10 meters away, felt as if their entire bodies were in a furnace. Even the war horses beneath them could not stop neighing. Obviously, when the war horses faced the temperature and the burning flames, even these tamed wild beasts could not remain calm. However, Kant and the knights' riding skills were superb. After a long period of training, these war horses were still in sync with the riders. Although they kept retreating, they did not panic. Enemy attack! Spread out! The knights also cried out and surrounded Kant. They wanted to turn their horses around and leave. However, the attackers would definitely not let them off. Whoosh whoosh! Suddenly, a shrill whistle could be heard from the dune. It approached from afar. The shrill whistle became even more ear-splitting, and its speed was extremely fast. Kant could not help but frown. Even the Swadian knights behind him gritted their teeth. Raise your shield! The last 2 Swadian knights behind him instantly raised the kite shield on their left arm. Their movements were well practiced, just like the textbook. In an instant, they rode behind Kant and raised the kite shields, blocking the sharp whistle. The sharp whistle came. Dang! Dang! A dull sound appeared on the kite shield. The Swadian knights with the shield on their left arms did not shake at all. They continued to ride their warhorse steadily. However, on the kite shield that was still painted with a golden lion on a red background, 2 white arrows had already pierced into the surface of the shield. The arrowheads penetrated through the iron sheet that was wrapped around the surface. The inertia carried by the arrowheads shook the tail feathers continuously. This was an extremely accurate shot. Similarly, this special white arrow was different from the traditional arrows of the Dukedom of Leo. It was more like the white arrow that was popular in the Silver Platter Kingdom and was famous for its great power. Similarly, the 2 archers were also very skilled in archery. In Kant and the others' eyes, they already had superb archery skills comparable to that of the Ravenstern Wardens. This was definitely not a defame. It was a praise to those archers. The Ravenstern Wardens were archers who had been trained in archery for more than 20 years. They were masters of archery that had been trained in the Misty Forest. They were second only to the elusive Ravenstern Rangers. Kant's expression was cold as he slowly turned his head to look. On the dune not far away, 2 archers in hoods and leather robes had already appeared at the top of the dune. They pulled out a new white feather-heavy arrow from the quiver on their back and continued to place it on their battle bows. They pulled their bows into full moon and elegantly released their fingers. In an instant, the arrows whistled that ear-piercing screech again. Their target was straight for Kant's face. Dang! Dang! The knights raised the kite shield, and the thick and well-made shield that was wrapped in iron sheet once again withstood 2 arrows that were heavier and thicker. And in just a short moment, the Swadian knights had already escorted Kant more than 100 meters away. With the protection of the kite shields, even the 2 archers on the dune were unable to continue shooting and pose too much of a threat to Kant. Moreover, under Kant's linen robe, there was also a close-fitting fine chain armor. "My lord, please remain vigilant." The Swadian knights protected Kant in the middle. Beside him, the captain of the knights reported to Kant, "We have already discovered the enemy's position. Are we allowed to charge and defeat the enemy as soon as possible?" "No, wait." Kant narrowed his eyes and rejected his suggestion. Looking at the 2 archers who had put away their bows on the dune, Kant said in a deep voice, "The good show is still to come." The flames swept across the land and formed a wall of fire. At the dune, the mysterious mage, who was also wearing a hood with leather robe and holding a magic staff, finally appeared again. He raised his magic staff and chanted a mysterious spell, shooting out a blazing ray of light between the gemstones. It instantly covered the path of Kant's retreat. The flames were also burning fiercely. The violent flames rose and formed a terrifying wall of flames 5 meters wide, around 20 meters long, blocking Kant's path of retreat. And on both sides, not only had 7 mysterious people who were also wearing hoods and leather robes appeared, but they were also holding steel longsword. It seemed like they were the attackers going to get close and kill Kant. "Stop! Stranger!" A Swadian knight angrily reprimanded, "This is the young son of Grand Duke Cameron, the Baron of the Dukedom of Leo, the ruler of Naran Desert, the Lord of Oasis. Look out, Lord Kant." He spoke righteously and looked at the 7 attackers on his left and right. His tone did not tremble at all, there was not a hint of fear in his heart. "Do you know that what you have done now has already violated the laws of the noble? You will be hanged. Even if you die, you will be punished by the god of war, Edmund. You will be banished to the war god's arcane realm to accept the endless cruel war." Ha! The 7 attackers who were holding steel longsword were not moved by the knight's reprimand. On the contrary, some of them even laughed softly as if they had heard a funny joke. Of course they were laughing at the line of the knight that was authorized by Kant. They laughed out loud mockingly. Looking at the appearance of these 7 attackers, Kant knew that they were indeed people from the Dukedom of Leo. After all, other than the nobles and commoners of the Dukedom of Leo, who knew the truth about him as a baron, the nobles and commoners of the other kingdoms would not care about this poor exiled worm. Of course, this was the beginning of a good show. Kant did not need to retreat. He calmly looked at the 7 attackers who were getting closer and closer to him. The sword of the king in the scabbard on his waist was faintly vibrating, reminding Kant that there was someone among them who posed a high threat to him and that he needed to be cautious and careful. Beside him, the Swadian knights raised their lances, their faces solemn under their huge helmets. The war horses uneasily dug through the sand beneath their feet. "I'll take care of it. You guys can eat the dust from behind." An attacker in front of them chuckled. Towards Kant and those knights, his eyes under the hood were filled with disdain and ridicule. "Die!" Almost in an instant, one of the attackers drew his long sword and moved forward. A fiery red light burst forth from his entire body like a raging flame. His speed soared. Even if the knights spurred their horses forward and raised their lances, they were easily dodged by him. On the contrary, he was getting closer and closer to Kant. His idea was simple. To catch a thief gang, first catch the leader. To kill a person, first kill Kant. So fast. Kant drew his sword, his eyes filled with shock. The attacker's speed was extremely fast. He was a genuine Grand Knight. The scorching aura was the same. Even if Kant had the body of a knight, he was still unable to turn his body to dodge this rapidly splitting sword. He could only subconsciously grip the hilt of his sword, making the sword of the king at his waist instantly draw out from the bottom to swing upwards, wanting to use his own weapon to barely block the fine steel longsword that was slashing towards him. Dang! The two swords intersected, but the eyes of the attacker revealed extreme shock. He could not hold the fine steel longsword in his hand. As for the sword of the king in Kant's hand, it easily sliced through his fine steel longsword like it was cutting butter. Following the inertia of the attacker, it sliced through half of his body, from the left lower ribs to the right neck. A rain of blood splashed out. In the rain of blood, the internal organs that had also been cut into two flew over Kant's head and crashed into the sand, rolling into the raging flames, twitching and struggling to turn into a pile of charcoal. Damn it! A cry of alarm came from behind. The faces of the rest of the attackers who had been watching the scene from behind, waiting for this guy to finish off Kant, were filled with disbelief and shock. There were also the two archers and the mysterious mage at the top of the dune. All of them widened their eyes. Looking at Kant riding his horse and raising the golden longsword, their initial shock turned into greed. It's that sword. It's mine. The greed in the eyes of the leading Grand Knight grew even more. He was sure that the longsword in Kant's hand was a precious magic longsword. It could even cut off a Grand Knight in one strike, and it could even reach the legendary divine weapon level. But just as they were about to group up, their bodies suddenly stiffened. At some point in time, knights with golden light all over their bodies appeared at the surrounding fire walls. And at the dune, there were similar knights standing at their sides. Chapter 275, The Mighty Golden Aura Flame. The atmosphere instantly turned stiff. There were three mysterious attackers on each side, but they were standing still and did not dare to move. They glanced at the knights who had appeared beside them at an unknown time. The golden light was like the sun above their heads, and waves of spiritual pressure were still spreading out. They were all grand knights who had already grasped extraordinary strengths and seemed to be extremely familiar with them. Cold sweat flowed down their foreheads. The scene was very stiff. No one spoke. Kant also quietly looked at them as if he was looking at a ferocious beast in a cage. His eyes were filled with some playfulness, but it made the hearts of the six attackers who were extremely close to them beat faster. Panic! Panic! Fear! That power seemed to be able to shock their souls, and even made them feel guilty as if they had a guilty conscience. It was like they were now the heinous criminals. They were indeed. Since they dared to assassinate a noble, then in the court of the noble, there was no regulation that would forgive them. The final result was that they had to be sentenced to death. Whether it was hanging or beheading, their crimes had to be fatal. This was the bottom line of the noble, a bottom line that could not be crossed. The threatening pressure from the sword of the king. There was also the talent number 2, King's Intimidate of the royal knights gathered together. What kind of joke is this? Among the attackers, someone gritted his teeth and forcefully broke away from the terrifying pressure that came from the heart. Looking at the 33 grand knights who were riding on war horses and the 70 ordinary knights who had surrounded them and trapped them firmly in the dune. A resolute look appeared in their eyes. They charged at Kant with a burst of red light. To catch a thief gang, one must first catch the leader. His idea was very good, but in front of the royal knights who were quietly watching them, this kind of action was more like a pathetic joke. The final resort of a desperate cornered beast. The king is fearless. A deep and muffled shout appeared in the mouth of the nearest royal knight. His two powerful legs tightened the horse's back. Hiss! The war horse that was wearing plate armor under its legs let out a roar as it rushed forward. Golden light also exploded on the body of this war horse's. Together with the royal knight on horseback, he raised the 3 meters long heavy armor-piercing lance. He charged forward in an instant. The regular 200% buff and the 500% increase in fearless status gave him a full 7 times of his strength. Pu. The heavy armor-piercing spearhead had already pierced through the attacker who was still charging forward. No, his eyes were filled with despair. The spearhead pierced through. Its speed was so fast that the attacker was unable to dodge. The heavy spearhead, which was as thick as a fist, pierced through the body in the leather robe and stabbed out from the back, dripping with blood. Even if the attacker struggled to let his fiery red aura burst out that was rolled like a raging flame, creating layers of scorching air waves, it was still unable to stop himself from being completely pierced through. Not to mention, the fist-sized heavy armor-piercing spearhead was shining with golden light. It was not threatened by this fiery red heat wave at all. Instead, it was like an incomparably sharp divine artifact. After piercing through the body, he held the lance with one hand. It directly lifted the attacker, who was not completely dead, in the air, as if he was showing off his arrogance. The Swadian royal knight naturally had the right to be arrogant. In a short moment. It did not take more than 2 minutes. This Grand Knight-level attacker was stabbed to death on the spot by any one of them. Even his corpse was lifted by a lance, becoming a symbol of showing off his strength. The remaining attackers did not even dare to act rashly. They all stood on the spot, looking at the huge number of royal knights and knights around them with their backs to each other. The greed and killing intent in their eyes disappeared completely. Only despair appeared in the face of death. There was also disbelief. The Baron, who was supposed to be down and out, exiled to the desert by the center of power, why were there so many grand knights and elite knights around him? They were puzzled from the bottom of their hearts, as well as disbelief that came from the depths of their souls. They were unwilling to believe all of this, and they were also unwilling to believe the fact that they were going to die. The leader of the attackers raised his head. Looking at Kant's calm expression, he tried his best to speak in a calm voice. Baron Kant, if I say that this is a misunderstanding, I don't know if you can understand. What do you think? Kant asked back, but the mocking smile at the corner of his mouth could not be hidden. We are all grand knights who possess extraordinary powers. The leader of the attackers gritted his teeth. If we fight with all our might, even you and your troops will suffer losses. His tone softened. But if you are willing to let us go with kindness, we are willing to do anything for you, unconditionally, and promise not to reveal what happened today. The other attackers nodded. At this time, other than responding, they did not have any excuses. This was because under the pressure of absolute power, they actually did not have the ability to bargain. Work for me. Kant opened his mouth and said in an unusually calm tone, you can exchange for a chance to live. This plan is not bad. However, the leader of the attackers had a gloomy expression. His initial calm expression disappeared. He looked coldly at Kant. He clenched the steel in his hand tightly. He said in a deep voice, we are all grand knights. There are also top-notch archers and mages in the mage tower who control the power of elements. Oh, Kant nodded. He looked quietly at the attacker who spoke and said indifferently, so what? So what? Kant did not care at all. He did not care about them at all. He turned his head and looked at the 33 shimmering Swadian royal knights around him. Kant laughed softly and said to him, you may not understand what I mean. His tone paused. He helplessly spread his hands. When you choose to be my enemy, you are destined to fail, and the result of failure is death. Simple logic. Then you can go to hell. The 6 attackers were enraged, instantly bursting out with their extraordinary powers. Some were scorching red, while others were deep blue, and their target was Kant. In that terrifying explosion, their figures even left long shadows. But so what? The horses neighed in the midst of the golden light. Kings courageous. After a deep shout, rays of golden light pierced through the darkness like the dawn. Kant stood still. He expressionlessly looked at the rapidly approaching attackers. He tightly clenched his sword of the king, and the gilded patterns on the sword were emitting waves of aura. However, as the golden lights on both sides intersected, 6 fist-sized heavy armor-piercing lances pierced through the 6 fast-moving shadows, bringing with them an incomparably sharp and terrifying force, relieving Kant's pressure. In the fearless status, the Swadian royal knights' golden flames grew higher and higher. Their entire bodies, along with the war horses beneath them, was mixed with the golden flames, as well as the exquisite gilded patterns on the fully covered plate armors. Their bodies seemed to be covered with a golden flame of armor, as mighty as the knights of the gods. Their mighty appearance did not look like the human soldier. A total of 700% status increase is a comprehensive increase, including this has extraordinary power of the flame. In the midst of the golden light, the tips of that 3 meters heavy armor-piercing lances. 6 bodies were propped up on their arms, blood dripping from the holes in their chests. Their internal organs had been stabbed to pieces. Their entire organs had been cooked by the golden light. It was impossible for them to survive. Even if they were still breathing faintly, it was very appropriate to call them corpses. They had died so easily. The eyes of the leader of the attackers had completely dimmed. A Grand Knight at the peak level. They had completely mastered the use of extraordinary power. They had unparalleled battle experience and battlefield literacy. How could these private soldiers, who were raised and secretly trained by the noble families, fight against these terrifying royal knights, who were trained on the battlefield? It was impossible. Therefore, they were defeated, dead, and had no life left. Including the 2 high-level archers at the top of the dune. The royal knights, who were guarding the archers, used their swords to cut off their heads. Their eyes, which were filled with regret, dimmed as they looked at the world that had nothing to do with them. However, the mysterious fire mage survived. This was arranged by Kant. Kant took the magic staff in his hand, which was embedded with gemstones, and was escorted to Kant by the 2 royal knights. The wall of fire between the dune had already been extinguished. The attackers who had been stabbed to death were also restrained. The masks on their faces were all removed. They were all unfamiliar faces. Even Kant had never seen such faces in the mainstream area of the Dukedom of Leo. They were all unfamiliar Grand Knights. They should belong to some noble families that had secretly trained Grand Knights. This was considered an unspoken rule in the Dukedom of Leo. The trained Grand Knights would not show themselves unless there was a crisis. It was equivalent to the family's foundation. These Grand Knights would help those noble families solve some problems that could not be stained with the fingerprints of the noble families. Therefore, these knights or Grand Knights were groomed in the dark. They were not registered on the list of Grand Knights in the Dukedom of Leo, so it was the best choice to send them over. The mage was escorted over. The mask on his face and hood had been removed. He looked like a middle-aged man in his 30s. He was very scholarly, but there was also a hint of cunningness in his frightened and uneasy eyes. It seemed that he was a formal mage who liked to take on private jobs. According to his level, he was comparable to a level 5 mage in the Unfoth Empire. However, Kant understood that the native mages of this world could learn more spells. Hence, they could arrange all kinds of spells in their spell slots. For example, the fire wall that he had just cast was definitely one of the spells. However, before he could cast any spells, he was approached by the royal knights. The result was naturally the same as now. When the mages lost their advantage in distance, they were not even as good as archers. In the face of the Grand Knights, who were terrifying in close combat and had no chance of resisting at all, they chose to surrender together, especially when they were surrounded by 11 Grand Knights and 20 Peak Knights. They had no intention of resisting at all, they could only accept their fate in vain. Chapter 276, The Mage's Leeway. The mage stood in front of Kant with extreme respect. With so many Grand Knights watching from the side, his so-called pride and self-respect as a mage had actually flown to God knows where with his dead companions. It was just groveling, as long as he could live. Thus, he planned to tell Kant everything he knew. He was very cooperative. Kant nodded in satisfaction. He rode on his warhorse, the sword of the king was sheathed again. However, the aura of a superior and the power of victory made the mage break out in cold sweat. It was obvious that he was extremely afraid of Kant and the Grand Knights around him. Mages were weaker than Grand Knights in close combat. The battlefield was cleared. The Swadian Knights had already placed the corpses together. Including the charred corpses in half, the thick smell of blood mixed with the charred smell filled the air. It was very unpleasant to smell. The mage scanned the corpses. They were all familiar figures. Although they had only known each other for a week and there were even some frictions and grudges, these people had turned into corpses just like that and were slaughtered like lambs. It still made his heart jump in fear. He turned his head to look to the side. Kant's lips curled into a smile when he saw that he could not bear to look directly at them. He reached into his arms and took out a handkerchief. He covered his mouth and nose to avoid the stench of corpses and asked in a muffled voice, "Who are they?" They. The mage opened his mouth and wanted to answer, but his lips trembled and he did not know what to say. He had just joined the team. And he had only joined the assassination team temporarily for the sake of profit. As for the 7 Grand Knight level attackers and the 2 top level archers, he actually did not know them at all. However, the mage raised his head and saw Kant and the surrounding Grand Knights staring at him like tigers watching their prey. His heart trembled. He could not say the word "don't know" no matter how hard he tried. Kant was not surprised that he could not say it. From the looks of it, he knew that they were not a long-term team. Instead, they were more like a team that was put together in a short period of time. "Don't know them?" Kant still covered his mouth and nose and asked. "Yes," the mage swallowed his saliva, his tone trembling. He did not get angry like Kant expect. Kant looked at him and continued to ask, "I used to study in the academy not far from the Mage Tower of Leo. I know many faces of mages, but you seem very unfamiliar. My memory is very good. I can confirm that you have never appeared in the Mage Tower of Leo, and you do not seem to be a mage in the Mage Tower. This makes me very confused. I'm a wandering mage from the Silver Platter Kingdom." The mage quickly replied, "The Holy Church of the Silver Platter Kingdom has started to expel all mage forces this year. The Mage Tower we're in can't be maintained, so we can only choose to leave." After hesitating for a moment, he continued, "I'm just an expelled mage, and I don't belong to the Mage Tower's inheritance mage. Thus, when I leave, I could only be abandoned. I came to the Dukedom of Leo in order to earn a living, and I wanted to find a place to settle down." "Oh, is that so?" Kant nodded. He had some understanding of the Silver Platter Kingdom. The Holy Church, which believed in the God of Holy Light, was indeed expelling non-Holy Church forces. For example, the Mage Tower, which also had magical powers, was within the range of expulsion. This was caused by the history of the Silver Platter Kingdom. After all, when this country was founded, it was supported and established by the Holy Church. Therefore, the power of the Pope was comparable to that of a king. It was a country with a system of combining politics and religion. It also had its own court protecting knights, which belonged to the top religious armed forces. There was a saying in the Silver Platter Kingdom: "The body belonged to the king, and the soul belonged to the Holy Light." The meaning was very clear. The king and his noble forces had the right to rule over the kingdom and the people, while the Holy Church was the pillar of faith for the people and even the noble. There were occasional unpleasant between the two sides, but there was no conflict. However, where there were people, there were fights. The noble forces were not willing to share their power with the Holy Church. The mage forces were the target of the noble forces. After all, a mage who had the power of the elements was much stronger than a priest who had the divine spell of healing and some weak attack spells. Both sides colluded to suppress the position of the Holy Church. However, from the looks of it, the Holy Church had obtained the final victory and expelled all the mages in the whole country. This had even obtained the king's permission. Perhaps there was also a compromise. The matters of the Silver Platter Kingdom naturally had nothing to do with Kant. On the contrary, he had a good impression of this mage who spoke everything he knew. He nodded his head in satisfaction and asked the final question. "Do you know your employer?" Kant asked. Employer? Mages clearly did not have the professional ethics of assassins. He was not an assassin either. After hesitating for a moment, he said to Kant, "My employer seems to be from the Dukedom of Leo, the East County." The one who interacted with me was just an ordinary gentleman, but I think the real employer must be hiding behind the scenes. The East County, Kent narrowed his eyes. This is really unexpected. He had thought that it would be the South County, or not the North County. He really did not expect the employer of the mage was from East County. After all, compared to the South County noble who had enemies all over the place, the North County noble who was currently greedy for salt mines, the East County, which had been closed for 10 years and did not have much communication with the outside world, was still in a neutral status with Kent. There was no enmity, no goodwill, and there was also no connection. Your lordship, Baron Kent. The mage gulped, he said hesitantly, that's all I know. Can you let me go? I'm just an ordinary wandering mage, and I even had a conflict with these teammates. When I cast the firewall, I didn't cast it directly at your team, but only blocked your path. So you and I should have some leeway. Yes, I'm very clear, Kent nodded. He was telling the truth, so he said, I won't kill you. I'm very grateful for your mercy. The mage immediately bowed in excitement. But before he could raise his head, a golden light shone, and Warhammer instantly hit the back of his head. His entire head was like an exploding watermelon, red and white splashed on the ground, and his body fell heavily to the ground. But someone will kill you. Kent's voice trailed off, and he said calmly, you know too much. The royal knight who had swung the Warhammer dismounted and threw the mage's body, whose head had exploded into pieces, to the side. At the same time, the knight dismounted and quickly searched for any valuable items on the bodies. Kent rode his horse to the side. The stench of the corpse and the smell of blood mixed together. It was very strong and made him somewhat disgusted. It was his decision to kill this mage. Although he was an elite, Kent did not intend to let his power be known to outsiders before he had fully digested the fruits of his victory and developed into a colossus. A slight flexing of muscle was enough to arouse the vigilance of those with ulterior motives. But to display absolute force. What greeted him was not submission, but hostility. Kent was not ready to completely fall out with the noble families of the Dukedom of Leo. At present, he had no more than 2,000 soldiers. Even if he could break through the stone pass and successfully enter the Dukedom of Leo, or even take over the barren North County, he could still attack the East and South counties. However, the ruling of the estates would be especially ineffective afterward. A mere 2,000 people, after he fully prepared, there would be a force of 5,000 people. Could they completely rule the entire Dukedom of Leo? That was impossible. This was even more unrealistic. If Kent did not have 5,000 people of regular army and 30,000 civilians, he would not start a war that could destroy the country. Currently, his troops were mainly focused on strategic defense and tactical attack. Defending the Naran Desert was not a problem. Secretly plotting against the Dukedom of Leo was just like how he had let Manit infiltrate the Stone Pass and let the bankrupt businessman Borg return to the East County to develop secretly. He was like boiled the frog in warm water and slowly took control of the Dukedom of Leo in his hands. With the help of the system, Kent could do it easily. The knights finished searching the bodies. They came to Kent's back. They reported, "My lord, we have obtained a magic staff, 2 parchment scrolls with incantations, and 300 great silver coins." As for the warhorse they were riding, they seemed to have exhausted their energy and died behind the dune. They are of no value. Yes, I understand, Kent nodded. These were all his spoils of war. Naturally, he had to plunder them. Just as he was about to continue leading the team away, a large number of cavalries appeared at the dune in the south. It should be a large-scale cavalry team advancing. Although the sound had yet to be heard, there was a lot of wind and dust behind them. They rode their horses at high speed, and yellow fine sand and dust filled the air. The knights immediately gathered next to Kent. But the alert was quickly lifted. The cavalry team that came from afar were the desert bandits and Sarandian horsemen. Rolf was leading the team and riding in front. When he saw the corpses under Kant and the knight's feet, he looked a little embarrassed. He whipped the warhorse under his horse and rushed over at high speed. He asked Kant urgently, "Lord Kant, are you hurt? We are late." "It's all right." Kant nodded and did not blame Rolf. Most of these attackers had magical powers. Even if Rolf caught up and rushed over, he probably would not be able to deal with these attackers. Instead, he would definitely suffer heavy casualties. If he won, it would probably be a Pyrrhic victory. This was the suppression of the troop class. After exchanging a few words, Rolf heaved a sigh of relief when he saw that no one was injured. However, when he turned his head to look at the corpses, he felt some fear towards the Grand Knight's combat strength. He could not help but say to Kant, "This world actually possesses such strength. I dare not imagine what kind of danger my cavalry will face if they encounter these 10 fellows. In the future, if we encounter them and do not have an advantage, we will immediately retreat." Kant said calmly, "Save the strength first." "Yes," Rolf sighed lightly, and a rarely seen desolate expression appeared on his face. After all, such terrifying combat strength was indeed something that he, who had come from the original world of history, could not accept. "Right," Kant said, "since you're here, then I'll give you 3 Swadian royal knights. They are all top-tier knights comparable to these Grand Knights and possess great power. Even if we encounter these Grand Knights again, I think we can temporarily alleviate the plight of the central post house." "Thank you for your help," Rolf was instantly overjoyed. Chapter 277, Return to Oasis Lookout. Kant did not stay here for long. These corpses would be handled by Rolf and his cavalry. Of course, the corpses would be buried. After all, these unfamiliar extraordinary people could not die in the Naran desert, even if the employer behind them definitely knew that Kant had done something to them. But this news could not be spread. The dead could not speak, and the buried dead could not speak either. The two sides separated. 3 Swadian royal knights joined Rolf's team. From now on, the 3 of them would be the high-end combat strength of the central post house. If they encountered a similar situation again, Rolf's troops would not be unable to resist. At the very least, they would be able to intimidate the other party. A royal knight at the peak of Grand Knight level would naturally be able to intimidate the other party. Kant led the team and left. There was a hint of regret in his eyes. In reality, that mage would not be able to smash his head into pieces with a single blow. If Kant directly sold this mage who had no intention of resisting to the merchants from Rivaden, he might earn even more dinars. After all, he was an extraordinary person who had mastered elemental spells. His value was definitely higher than ordinary humans and Jack Allen's. Most importantly, he could also prevent the leak of information, which was more useful than becoming a corpse. But Kant had no choice but to kill him. Although it was a pity, there was nothing he could do. Kant cleared up his mind and continued to trek with 100 cavalries. The sun was burning above his head. The sandy sea in front of him was becoming more and more spectacular. The continuous dune was like the rolling waves of the sea, connecting the horizon and forming this cruel environment with the endless sand grains. Looking from the top of the dune, everywhere was yellow and orange, with the desolate feeling of extreme desolation that belonged to nature. There was no longer any beautiful color. Perhaps in the dark part of the dune in the low-lying area, one could find some greenery, but it was also very scarce. The surface of the Naran desert was extremely short of water. Its environment was harsh, even more brutal than the Sahara Desert on Earth. Except for the low areas where the subterranean river flowed, there might be a few puddles. Digging the sand layer could obtain a small amount of drinking water, but there were very few oases that could form a fragile ecological chain and could sustain life and reproduction. Currently, only the Oasis lookout was found in the southern part of the desert. It had already been occupied by Kant. It was now the center of his estate and the overlord-type castle in this desert region. 2 days later. Early in the morning, Kant rode his horse forward. The knights behind him followed closely. 100 people were like a long dragon. After a long journey, they were still in a neat formation. This was the discipline of the elite troops. However, most of them removed the visor of their helmets, or carried their huge helmets to the back of their necks, revealing their tired faces. In the end, they utilized the relatively cool temperature in the early morning to wake themselves up as soon as possible. They had set off from dawn, and it had already been 2 hours' journey. According to the time, they would arrive at the destination soon. They all knew in their hearts. They spurred their horses over the dune, and a black figure that looked like a needle tip appeared on the horizon. When a knight noticed it, his face immediately lit up with joy. He reminded his comrades in a low voice. After careful observation, they all beamed with joy. Even the speed of the warhorse under him had increased significantly. Apparently, it was also because of the sudden fervent atmosphere, he sensed the joy of arriving at the destination. The needle-like black shadow was the high-level watchtower of Trondheim Castle, which was 40 meters tall. It was as tall as a 14-story building. It would take more than 10 minutes to climb from the bottom to the top at a constant speed. However, the advantage of height was that it could detect the abnormal situation in the surroundings as soon as possible. For example, Kant and the others. Although the dune in the Naran desert was undulating, it was not as complicated as the mountains. From the top of the watchtower, one could see the surroundings clearly. The team of 100 knights was soon discovered. The newly recruited 40 desert bandits ran out of the city gate and spread out into a scout formation. With their light armors and mobility, they quickly approached Kant and the others. They were the first to identify the enemy before making any plans. This could be considered Kant's core area of influence. Basically, coming here meant that the blockade line formed by the central post house had been broken through. The troops stationed in the castle would move out, and Phyrantus would decide whether to go out and fight to defeat the enemy, or they could defend the city walls and wait for reinforcements, waiting to be exhausted and defend and counterattack. These desert bandits were just testing the waters. If the enemy was too strong, then they would defend the city walls and rely on the excellent city defenses to defend to the death. This would allow the cruel environment of the Naran desert to indirectly weaken the enemy and give them an opportunity to take advantage of it. As for the enemy being too weak, then naturally, there was no need to say anything more. It would be a whirlwind-like attack. Oasis Lookout had quite a number of elite troops. Although Kant had taken away the 188 Swadian heavy cavalries when he left, there were still 97 Swadian knight, 45 Mamluks and 103 Viegir marksmen stationed in the castle. In addition, they had recruited 80 desert bandits and 20 Viegir archers in the past 2 weeks. Although there weren't many of them. But with their elite strength, they could definitely deal with the ordinary troops. Soon, the 40 desert bandits arrived at Kant. When the two met, the desert bandits immediately became excited and stopped their horses. They quickly got off their horses and greeted respectfully, "My lord, I didn't expect to meet you in the morning. You're finally back." "Yes, I'm back," Kant nodded. He did not get off his horse. He stretched out his hand and said, "There's no need to be so polite." "Understood." The desert bandits stood up. They were still respectful as they looked at the 70 Swadian knights behind them. Their eyes revealed a look of envy. However, when they turned their heads to look at the 30 Swadian royal knights, their eyes revealed a look of shock. Thanks to their long career as bandits, they actually did not dare to act rashly towards the royal knights. It was a fear that came from the bottom of their hearts. It was the fear like a small group of desert bandits less than 10 people encountered hundreds of Mamluks. And now, it was just the pressure that a mere 30 people gave them. "All right, let's go back." Kant took off the hood on his head, his face also showing a hint of fatigue. Seeing that this group of desert bandits had sensed the strength of the royal knights, he did not explain too much. He only instructed, "Let's go back and arrange breakfast and accommodation. This time, we all need sufficient rest." "Understood," the desert bandits nodded. Immediately, 10 of them rode their horses back. Kant and the others followed. After passing through a few dune, the watchtower became clearer and clearer. The 20-meter-tall tower gradually appeared in front of them. There were also 10-meter-tall city walls and layers of arrow towers. The entire castle was exposed in front of them. There were also lush date palm trees, cultivated fields, sparkling lakes, and busy peasants with tools. There were camel caravans returning with coarse salt, as well as the smoke rising from the top. This was the south gate of the Trondheim castle. It was beginning to look prosperous. Fyrentus was leading 10 Swadian knights to welcome them. Seeing them come over, he quickly walked over and personally pulled Kant's horse's head reins. He bowed respectfully and said, "Lord Kant, I haven't seen you for 2 weeks. I really miss you." "Indeed, it has been 2 weeks," Kant sighed and nodded. From the time he left until now, he had returned. 2 weeks, half a month had passed. When he returned to the city gate, the leader of the trade caravan, Jocelyn, was standing there. When he saw Kant return, he also bowed respectfully and greeted him. "My lord, it has been a long time. As promised, I have come to join your team." "You are very welcome." Kant smiled and nodded. At the same time, he dismounted from his horse and said to Fyrentus, "These 30 royal knights are the guards of the council hall alone. If they encounter any enemies with extraordinary strength, report to me as soon as possible. I will arrange for them to deal with them." "Could it be that they are also?" Fyrentus raised his eyebrows slightly and then nodded. "Understood." There was no need to explain. This was the foundation that would be garrisoned in the castle in the future. Fyrentus, who had some understanding of the dukedom of Leo, understood in his heart that even the neighboring country would find it difficult to gather 30 grand knights with extraordinary strength to garrison in a castle alone for defense. Now, Trondheim had it, and it could be said to be a big deal. It had even solved the current predicament of Kant's forces, which lacked extraordinary combat strength. Everyone entered the castle. The fragrance had already spread out from the council hall. It was already early in the morning. Although the soldiers in the castle had already finished eating, the chef was still busy preparing more exquisite food for Kant and the returning knights. After a few days of trekking, he finally returned to the castle to have a good rest. Kant sat in the main seat of the council hall. Fyrentus and Jocelyn accompanied him and chatted with each other in a relaxed manner. At the same time, they reported on the administrative affairs of the castle after they left. It hadn't changed much. It was all arranged by Kant before he left. Jocelyn had returned less than 2 days ago, and had already handed over the trade caravan of Rivaden to his nephew. At the same time, he also brought back good news. He reported to Kant, "My lord, King Yarajek of the Kingdom of Vigilance has heard that you are short of funds and have taken out a loan of 100,000 dinars. This is due to the friendship between the two countries. You only need to repay the principal. King Yarajek has said that there is no need to pay the interest of 20,000 dinars. It's like this. If there's a chance, please thank King Yarajek for me." Kant nodded. This was really an additional pleasant surprise. 20,000 dinars was not a small amount. To be able to avoid paying this amount of interest, it could be considered as alleviating the financial pressure. At the same time, Kant thought of the spoils of war that he had captured in the underground city of the Karst cave. He turned to the servant waiting beside him and instructed, "Go and inform my knights to transport all the spoils of war that I have captured this time over." "Understood," the servant nodded and left quickly. Kant said to Jocelyn, "We have captured a considerable amount of gold this time. Help me estimate the price." Jocelyn replied, "I'm willing to help." Gold could be exchanged for dinar since it was still a village. It could be considered a hard currency. Chapter 278, Fangorn Forest of the Lord of the Rings. Soon, the spoils of war were carried over by the 6 knights. There were 6 sacks in total, and they seemed to be quite heavy. They were carefully placed on the long table in the council hall. These were the spoils of war that Kant had obtained from his journey this time. After sweeping through the sacks and making sure that he had not missed anything, Kant nodded at the 6 Swadian knights and said, "You've worked hard. Go back and eat first. Rest well today. I will arrange for a 2-day holiday for all of you." Understood, the knights were delighted. They bowed respectfully and left the council hall. After the journey, they needed to have a good rest. In the Trondheim castle, they could enjoy the comfortable life brought about by the holiday. This was the benefit of increasing their strength. Kant did not care. In fact, after he rested for the night, he had to continue his busy administrative work the next day. After all, after leaving for 2 weeks, the current Trondheim castle still needed to be adjusted slightly. For example, he could only personally handle the various trivial matters in the system. But now, it was better to deal with these spoils of war as soon as possible. The feeling of being in debt was very uncomfortable, not to mention that it was a loan to the kingdom of Vigilance. Kant waved his hand and said, "These are the things. Please allow me to look through them," Jocelyn replied. "As you wish," Kant said. Jocelyn stood up and went to the 6 bulging sacks. He reached out and opened them. Golden yellow appeared in front of his eyes. They were all strips of gold with exquisite and mysterious engravings on them. He opened the sacks one by one and found that they were all made of this kind of gold. The circular candlestick above his head emitted a light that illuminated the gold in the sacks below. The purity of this gold is truly astonishing. Jocelyn was the leader of the trade caravan, so his experiences were quite rich. Moreover, before he started trading, he was still an elite Vigilance horseman. If it was not for his bad luck and the fact that he did not have enough achievements, he would have long become the envy of everyone, a Vigilance knight. However, during his trading and military career, Jocelyn had a very deep understanding of gold. After pondering for a moment, he raised his head and said to Kant, "I think that each bag of gold here is worth 50,000 dinars. If it was during wartime, such pure gold could be sold for 55,000 to 60,000 dinars. 50,000 dinars. Kant's eyes lit up. This was the information he wanted to get. 2 bags of gold could make up for the amount of the loan. There were 6 bags of gold here. If that was the case, it would be a huge sum of 300,000 dinars. Yes. Jocelyn nodded and continued, "Gold is already a top currency in Caradia. The Nords are especially obsessed with gold. However, the dinar is still made of silver, so it is more widely circulated. I need to exchange Kant said to Jocelyn. When the trade caravan arrives, use this gold to make up for the loan and exchange it all for the dinar. You will be responsible for it." Understood, Jocelyn nodded. However, as he said this, he looked a little hesitant, as if he wanted to say something. Kant naturally saw his hesitation. He frowned and asked, "Jocelyn, you seem to have some suggestions." "This." Jocelyn's expression was even more hesitant. However, looking at Kant, he still made a decision and sighed at him, "Although it's not good to say this, I still suggest not to trade these gold with the trade caravan of Rivaden. It would be a huge loss." Kant was slightly stunned, he frowned, and asked, "Tell me your reason." Jocelyn naturally would not lie to him. The current leader of the trade caravan was already listed in the system's troop class. It meant that he was Kant's loyal troop class. "It's like this. To be honest, this story is a little strange. If it wasn't for you, I think I would never have told this secret." Jocelyn organized his words. He solemnly reported to Kant, "My family originated from the outer seas of Caradia. On a continent called Pender, we were once a noble. However, my cousin was stripped of his noble title because he betrayed a powerful knight group. Our family members who came from the same clan were also implicated. We could only escape from Pender and came to Caradia to avoid pursuit. Therefore, I have some understanding of Pender." Pender continent, Kant narrowed his eyes slightly. According to Jocelyn's words, a traitor noble from Pender who was also named Jocelyn immediately appeared in his mind. You mean, the Jocelyn who betrayed the Twilight Knight? Lord Kant, you really know everything. Jocelyn nodded and said dejectedly, that's my cousin. Ha, Kant snorted helplessly. Thinking about the various continents in the mod, Karadia was actually connected to Pender. This indeed made him feel a little funny. However, since Jocelyn had told this story, Kant, who had the system as a cheat, did not refute it. He only said in a deep voice, I won't mind your past, just as I appreciate your talent. Thank you for your trust. Jocelyn was very touched. Kant asked calmly, then, what does this story have to do with gold? You still have 2 empty trading caravans. Jocelyn replied, when the people of Ravenstern appeared in your castle, I knew that this miracle land was actually connected to the Pender continent. The Pender continent is more prosperous than the continent of Karadia, so the demand for gold is also very high. Therefore, the price of gold can basically rise a lot. It's a trade caravan. Kant suddenly realized that there were indeed 2 empty trade caravans in his hands, so he asked, then can you be sure that the trade caravan will enter the Pender continent? The system's introduction said that the destination of the trade caravan was random. However, Jocelyn said firmly, yes. Very well, in that case. Kant nodded and directly made arrangements for him. Then you will be in charge of a single trade caravan. As long as you can open up the trade of the Pender continent, then I will remember your meritorious service. I will do my best, Jocelyn said solemnly. After coming to the land of miracles, I can freely pass through the passage between Karadia and here. However, I still have a kind of palpitation towards the Pender continent in my heart. If I want to, I may be able to pass through it at any time. No, I should be able to pass through it and return. Yes, Kant nodded. A plan had already appeared in his heart. If the Pender continent could travel back, then all kinds of resources that originated from the Pender continent could be purchased wantonly. After all, compared to Karadia, the Pender continent had more resources. And at this moment, a dialog box popped up on his retina. Ding system prompt. The leader of the trade caravan, Jocelyn, can enter the Pender continent through the space-time crystal wall. Currently, there is an empty trade caravan that can be bound. Yes/no? This was a prompt from the system. Kant did not hesitate at all and immediately chose in silence, bound. The dialog box refreshed. Ding system prompt. Currently, the trade caravan is bound to the Pender continent. The system had already noted that there was a blank trade caravan bound to Pender continent and could travel there at any time. Very good. Kant nodded lightly. He had gained another trade route. After all, Rivaden's trade caravan would only arrive in the first week of every month. Some things were more difficult to deal with. Now that there were more trade routes, it was easier to deal with them. There could be trade caravans coming and going every 3 weeks of every month. Most importantly, the new Pender trade caravan was the caravan that would make money for him. Kant also had a blank trade caravan. Similarly, he could randomly choose a city in a certain world and open up a trade route through the space-time crystal wall. Since Jocelyn was still here, Kant did not hesitate. He directly communicated with the system in his mind and issued the order to use this trade route to randomly select a world and a city. Ding system prompt. Trade caravan binding, random drawing. On the retina, the dialog box instantly listed out a huge round plate, similar to the time when the village was drawn. Kingdom of Swadia, Kingdom of Rodux, Kingdom of Nords, Kingdom of Viagirs, Kingdom of Saran Sultanate. Kingdom of Sarleon, Kingdom of Raventern, Kingdom of Feartvi, Dasha tribe, Imperial Expeditionary Force, Kato tribe, and Nordo Elf Force. Even the Great Ming Empire, Manchurian Nuhen, the Mongolian Golden Family, the Great Han Empire, the Hun Empire, Oda Nobunaga, Nagao Kage Tora, the countries of Southern Europe, the countries of Northern Europe, Eastern Europe, and even the countries of the Middle East, and so on. All ages, all regions, all kinds of formal history, or fantasy world. All exist on this disk. This was the power contained in all of the mods in Mount and Blade. The disk finally stopped. The name of the power finally appeared. Ding system prompt. Your trade caravan has communicated with the Middle-earth continent, Fangorn Forest. Fangorn Forest trade caravan has begun binding. A rule appeared on his retina. Kant was slightly stunned. Looking at the name of the fraction on it, it instantly appeared in his mind. Those seemingly lush ancient trees, but in fact, they were between life and plants, the Ents. They could indeed be considered as life, and they were even older than humans in the Middle Earth. And the Fangorn forest originated from the oldest Ent, and it was also the leader of all Ents, Fangorn, which Kant understood from the information from the Lord of the Rings, Treebeard. Back then, he was the one who had promised the Hobbit to lead his troops to defeat Isengard's Saruman army. In the mod, The Last Day of the Lord of the Rings, there was also such a force. And it was a hidden force. Who would have thought that after a random selection, Kant would actually choose the Fangorn forest? With the blessing of the system, it meant that Kant's trade caravans were allowed to enter the Fangorn forest, which was originally a place where strangers could not trespass. They could go there to do business and engage in economic exchanges with the Ents. Although the Ents did not have so-called businesses or handicrafts, the Fangorn forest had all kinds of mystical items. For example, the natural spring water that could speed up the growth of vegetation. If they were lucky, they could bring back the Ents that were 6.7 meters tall. This would undoubtedly increase the number of Ace troop class in Kant's troop class. They could enter the Sceneway range or take root in the Oasis lookout and pretend to be big trees. However, at the crucial moment, they would engage in fight. It was enough to shake the enemy's morale. Chapter 279, Future Arrangements. Kant's lips curled into a smile. It had to be said that the Pender caravan and the Fangorn forest caravan were truly a pleasant surprise. With Jocelyn as the leader of the trade caravan, the Pender caravan was like a fish in water. Whether it was exchanging gold for dinar or using dinar to purchase some of the Pender continent's resources, they were all very suitable. As for the Fangorn forest, it belonged to the intermediate magic world and was located in the Middle-earth of the Lord of the Rings. Naturally, there were many precious resources. They were all trade routes worth developing. Kant was very satisfied. After pondering for a moment, he instructed Jocelyn, when Manad returns to the castle, you two will meet to discuss how to distribute the following trade routes and ensure that we obtain the maximum profit. Understood, Lord Kant. Don't worry. Jocelyn nodded solemnly. He was not yet a hero-level NPC, but a subordinate of Kant. Strictly speaking, he was only a slightly special troop class. He was the leader of the trade caravan who had the potential to become a hero-level NPC. That was why he was able to gain Kant's trust and was given the command to lead the trade caravan alone. It was enough for him to cooperate with Manad. Once the power was newly established, everything would be simplified. As for the castle, there was no need to worry about it. When Kant left, Trondheim was already on the right track. For example, Fyrentus, Kant's most trusted knight, was entrusted with the management of the castle. It could be said that he held an important position, but in reality, his main focus should be on the military aspect first. He was vigilant of the surrounding environment and set up various layers of alert networks, and prevent any mistakes or encounters with unfamiliar enemy troops during the Lord's absence. In other words, it was basically to maintain stability around the castle. This was also what Kant had entrusted to Fyrentus before he left. After all, the depths of the desert were unknown. According to the intelligence gathered by the captives of the Kingdom of Greymane, there was an extremely hot devil zone in the deepest part of the desert. Even the well-prepared Jack Allens, who were gifted with great endurance, did not dare to set foot in it. Even the expeditionary army organized by the Kingdom of Greymane in an attempt to conquer the human countries would rather endure the cruel environment of the desert and walk around the Devil Land for another 30 days, rather than spend 10 days to cross the terrifying Devil Land. There was only endless deathly stillness in the death zone, as if it was a forbidden zone for life. When that sandstorm suddenly appeared in the depths of the desert, Kant became slightly vigilant. This sandstorm might have something to do with the Devil Land. Moreover, Kant led his troops to the ancient passage and found the underground city of the Karst Cave. The Pope, who had already turned into a lich, actually asked him to go to the depths of the desert. Although he didn't mention that it was the Devil Land, Kant suspected that it was there. The system had given him a temporary side quest to confirm that. This needed to be taken seriously. Kant's vigilance towards the depths of the desert had reached an even higher level. Phyrantus noticed Kant's solemn expression and reported, "Lord Kant, during the time you left the castle, everything was as usual." The salt camel caravan that went to the depths of the desert also did not find anything unusual. "Okay," Kant nodded, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "But this is not normal. If there was no abnormality, then it was the biggest abnormality." The system gave a hint. The undead Lich Pope pointed directly to the depths of the desert. Moreover, using the words of the high-level Jack Allen, translated into human language, it happened to be the Devil Land. When Kant recalled it in his mind, he felt that it was strange. Especially in the Karst Cave, he really saw the devil creature. Most importantly, Kant had come to a conclusion from the fragmented information. The end of the era of the ancient gods was caused by the war between the gods and the devils. Now, these ancient races had all appeared in the hidden places. The Pope even gave him a mission, asking him to go to the depths of the desert and save the daughter of the god in the eternal coffin in the so-called Holy City of Sun. Kant did not care whether he saved her or not, but the reward of the temporary side quest given by the system was the Spring Eye. This was something Kant needed to get. The potential of the Oasis lookout was not only like this. With the help of the system, there was still room for development. Although the initial stage was a little difficult, as long as the area of the Oasis was expanded to the point where it could form an excellent self-circulation, nourishing the surrounding desert, and nourishing the various shrubs that could not grow due to the lack of water. After taking shape, the value of this oasis would definitely not be inferior to the Sinway range. It would be a green ocean in this barren desert. At that time, even if there was no fertile soil, it would be able to ensure the agricultural development of the entire castle. Even if the connection between the Oasis lookout and the Sinway range was blocked, it would also be able to obtain sufficient supplies. The oasis in the vast desert sea would be as dazzling as a pearl. Most importantly, it could also be used as an outpost, a transit station, and an important logistics base. Kant had always thought of going to the other side of the desert to take a look. That was the Mannheim coast. It was said that it was made up by Kingdom of Greymane formed by high-level Jack Allen, Kingdom of Lizardmen, and a coastal colony formed by the Elven Parliament sent by the Elven Republic. It was different from the New World dominated by human countries and occupied by other races. It was really fascinating. If Kant did not need to develop, he would not have the time and energy to worry. If he had sufficient military strength and savings, as well as the energy to fully control the overall situation, he would have long sent troops to the opposite side of the Naran Desert on camels that could cross the desert. Even Jack Allen could come on foot, so how could the camels, who were naturally more tolerant with the desert environment, not be able to cross? If there was a chance, Kant would definitely go to the Mannheim coast to take a look. But tiredness struck him. The sequela of the long journey was that he felt a little sleepy. The breakfast was not finished yet, but Kant was not too hungry. He drank the sugar water in one gulp and stood up to say to Phyrantus and Jocelyn, "I'll leave this to you first. I'll go back to my room to rest." "Understood." Phyrantus and Jocelyn immediately stood up to send them off. They were trustworthy talents. Their individual abilities could help Kant handle the current situation. I'll leave it to you. Kant nodded in relief as well. Under the guidance of the pretty maid, he walked towards the stairs. He was getting more and more tired. Behind him, the kitchen servant asked, "My lord, your breakfast won't take long to be finished. Should I send it to your room later?" "No need." Kant replied, "When I wake up, I will arrange for you to heat it up and send it up." "Yes, my lord," the servants replied. They had already eaten breakfast. They used the bread and dried meat that they had roasted over the campfire last night and mixed it with the hot water to swallow it down to their stomachs. Although it was a simple dish, it was enough to fill their stomachs and ensure that their basic needs were satisfied. Back in the room, the maid behind him also brought dessert. It was fried bread wrapped in honey, with jam made from wild berries found in the Sinway range. The whole color was bright purple and red, and the taste was sour and sweet. Kant ate a few pieces at random, his throat had a sweet feeling. But it was no problem to quench his hunger. It also made him more tired. The maids wanted to help Kant undress. They were all young girls from wealthy families who were specially selected to serve Kant. They were 14 to 18 years old. They were young and lively. They wore clean and tidy made clothes. Their small faces were cute and pretty, their looks were above average. They could be considered young apples that had just matured. Many noble families liked this taste. It was naturally the same for the continent of Karadia in the feudal era of cold weapons. However, for Kant, the weariness made him wave his hand, indicating that they could leave. "My lord, if there's anything you need, please call us." The little apples' expressions were gloomy as they pouted and slowly retreated. Their big black and white eyes were filled with resentment towards Kant, as well as their somewhat rusty seduction. Being able to marry a noble was their dream. Of course, this dream was unrealistic to them. Kant, who was a noble and even a king had to treat him with respect, was a woman's honor to have sex with him. This was an act that could make the families behind them feel honor. Kant also understood the reason. But as a supreme lord, he didn't need to care at all. He took off his clothes and fell into a deep sleep. The long journey in the desert was exhausting, and so was riding a warhorse. After he fell asleep, he had frequent dreams. The ruins of the peak of the mountain, the ruins of the temple in the mountain, the ancient passage and the underground city of the karst cave, as well as the demons, undead liches and even the experiences he had encountered, all of these made Kant's dreams even stranger. He even dreamed of the goddess and the witch that he had shot to death. He dreamed of the fall of the gods and demons in the ancient times. He also dreamed of the experiences he had when he was young. His father, Cameron, his brother who always had a cold face, his biological mother who he had no impression of, the noble who had malice toward him, and his aunt whom he had only met once. Perhaps it was because he was too tired, Kant dreamed a lot of things. But in the end, he dreamed of the sandstorm in the depths of the desert. Kant seemed to have returned to that day. The apprentices carried out the experiment without knowing their own strength, but they let go of a golden light. The sandstorm immediately appeared, and the terrifying weather that blotted out the sky and covered the sun with sand and stones instantly appeared in the desert. It brought with it the terrifying power of nature, as well as some doubts that came from the depths of the desert, which was known as the Devil Land. No one knew what exactly happened there. Kant also did not know what was the golden light that he had inadvertently let go. But his heart was throbbing heavily. Opening his eyes, Kant's dream ended, and he slowly woke up. It was still his luxurious room. He turned his head slightly. The blue sky and white clouds outside the window, as well as the orange and yellow sea of sand in the distance. Only then did he react and slightly twisted his neck, but he felt that his entire body was rather stiff. He said, "Someone, get me a glass of water." His stomach rumbled, and at the same time, he shouted, "And my breakfast." Now he was thirsty and hungry. He remembered that he had arranged this before he went upstairs to his room. Soon, when a maid heard Kant's call, she came in with a tray and bowed very respectfully. "Good morning, my lord." Chapter 280, The Returning Caravan. Hearing the maid's greeting, Kent was slightly stunned. "Good morning." He turned his head to look out of the window. The sky was bright, but it was not as bright as noon or afternoon. Clang 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 clang. A dull bell rang. It was the bronze bell ringing. After ringing about it 8 times, it meant that it was 8 o'clock in the morning. It was not dawn but morning already. Kent was a little stunned. This seemed to be no different from the time when he had just come to the room to sleep. Could it be that he had only slept for a short period of time? Kent was puzzled. The pretty maid pursed her lips and smiled lightly. She explained to Kent, "My lord, you slept for a day and a night. It is now the morning of the 2nd day. I think you must be famished. You should fill your stomach with these desserts first." On the tray, there were desserts that were similar to yesterday's. However, they were steaming hot. It was obvious that they had just been made. They were sprinkled with dried dates and looked very tempting. A day and a night. Kent rubbed his hungry stomach and got out of bed. His entire body was stiff from sleeping for a long time. He twisted his neck and sat on the chair in his pajamas. He instructed the pretty maids, "Tell the kitchen to prepare breakfast. I'm very hungry now." "Yes," a maid immediately turned around to pass on the message. There were desserts on the table. Kent stuffed a few pieces. It was really to satisfy his hunger. He did not like to eat sweets as his main meal, even though the price of this food was slightly higher. This was a habit he had developed over a long period of time. In the dukedom of Leo, the food was mostly salty meat products. Although there were desserts, most of them were honey. Things like white sugar, brown sugar, and other things had never appeared before. After all, to obtain this kind of sugar, one needed sugarcane, a plant that produced a very high amount of sugar. However, the dukedom of Leo did not have sugarcane. In Kent's impression, things like sugarcane had also never appeared before. It was just like how livestock like camels had never left any records in the human countries of this world. For example, when Kent and Manad led the camel caravan to the Stone Pass, they attracted many curious gazes. However, most of them treated the camels as a different type of large workhorse. Their movement speed was not fast, and they did not have the high explosive power of war horses, therefore, they quickly turned their curiosity into indifference. Among the horse breeds, the most precious was naturally the warhorse. As long as a country had a large number of war horses, they could build a large and powerful cavalry force. They were the trump card on the battlefield and could easily decide the situation on the battlefield. As for the horse breeds that were beneficial to the people's livelihood and could only carry goods, they were not considered important at all. This was the difference between the two worlds. After all, even the crystal wall system was not the same. Even the basic laws were fundamentally different. At least in this world, there were no camels and sugarcane. In comparison, there were no demons, spells, gods, and other things on earth. Obviously, they were not the same and comparison was not relevant. Soon, the pretty maids brought breakfast. Fried steak, fried eggs, fried fish, and unknown tender wild vegetables, small skewers of edible berries. There was also oatmeal, toast, and date palm. The food was very rich. From this, it could be seen that the Sceneway range was on the right track, and began to provide some supplies to the Oasis lookout. For example, these tender wild vegetables and berries were all brought back by the camel caravan. They were uprooted and temporarily transplanted into a wooden basin. After watering them, they would be transported back. This could guarantee its half a month's worth of vitality. If they were lucky, they could even survive under the shade of the date palm tree. The shade of the trees could block the sunlight. The running water in the canal could nourish these edible wild vegetables and berry shrubs. Due to the camel caravan's carrying capacity, although the amount transplanted was not much, it could provide for the Lord Kant to enjoy 3 meals a day with the hard-earned delicate wild vegetables and fresh berries. Just like Kant was enjoying the delicious food now. The lamb chops with a fresh and tender taste, the whole fish that was fried perfectly, as well as the berries and wild vegetables that were used as side dishes. The taste was excellent. Kant was stunned. This was even more delicious than before he left. After taking a bite of the soft and crisp bread mixed with the fried eggs and swallowing it, Kant turned his head and asked the maid who was waiting beside him, "Are all the kitchens nowadays managed by professional chefs?" "You are right, my lord." The maid next to him smiled sweetly and answered Kant respectfully, "The 3 chefs and 7 helpers in the council hall are all professional chefs learned by the Artisan Guild." "Well, this is very good," Kant nodded. The maid added, "Even the chefs in the tavern and the chefs in the military camp are all professional chefs trained in the Artisan Guild. The quality of the food in the castle has improved a lot. Compared to the food cooked by our aunties, it is much more delicious." "I see," Kant chuckled. It seemed that after leaving, Firentus had recruited and trained full-time staff. The Artisan Guild could train all kinds of talents. Especially the crating talents. Whether they were blacksmiths, tailors, chefs, salt makers, or tanners, they could all be trained. Ordinary civilians who did not have any skills became the pillars of jobs that were urgently needed in all walks of life. Chefs were like this. However, most of them were talents in weapons workshops, blacksmith shops, salt workshops, and sugar workshops. The amount of salt produced in the current Trondheim castle had increased from 200 bags to 500 bags. The profits they could earn each month reached 25,000 great silver coins. Thanks to the purchase of more one-humped camels to form the camel caravan, they could transport more coarse salt back. However, they had to thank the excellent salt workers for replenishing their losses. 25,000 great silver coins per month was a terrifying number in Kant's eyes. If it could be exchanged for dinar, he would laugh his head off. Unfortunately, money could not be exchanged. The dinar could only be exchanged with the gold. Therefore, Kant sent Manad to the stone pass to inquire about the price of gold, a precious metal. Now, he had accumulated close to 100,000 great silver coins. If it was converted into gold, according to Kant's rough understanding of the price, there should be 1,000 gold eagles, this kind of country-to-country currency. It was similar to a check, which was not circulated to the outside world. Only high-ranking noble families and countries would circulate it. However, as long as there was money, it could still be bought. Kant only sent Manad to probe in secret. If he could get a gold eagle, he would know the price of the gold and how much dinar it could be converted into. This would give Kant a clear idea of how to make money quickly in the future and how to exchange for a large amount of dinar conveniently. Soon after breakfast, the hunger in his stomach disappeared, bringing a sense of satisfaction. The pretty maid quickly tidied up the table. Kant walked to the top floor. The council hall had 6 floors. The scenery at the top was very good and could overlook the entire castle. If he wanted to overlook his Oasis lookout and Naran Desert, he could also go to the 40-meter-high watchtower to look at the surrounding scenery. It was even more magnificent and spectacular. However, Kant was not going to enjoy the scenery. He was going to the apprentice dormitory. This was the basic building of the Mage Tower in the Unfoth Empire. It was where the apprentices lived and rested. Since Kant had selected this building, it had been combined with the council hall. At a cost of 50 dinars per week, he was allowed to recruit one mage apprentice who had mastered a basic spell. Kant came to the apprentice dormitory. The exquisite patterns were mysterious and graceful like the Unfoth Empire. His mind communicated with a certain golden card in his mind. "System, use the rule card," Kant ordered in a deep voice. A dialog box instantly popped up on his retina. Ding, system prompt. Double recruitment, constant, used. Apprentice dormitory, the weekly recruitment has increased to 2 people. The golden card instantly shattered into pieces. Data streams gathered in the apprentice dormitory in front of him. The rules of the building had been changed. Although it was not much, it had a qualitative improvement. This was the level up that Kent had planned. After solving this problem, he came to the edge of the top floor of the council hall. Vigier marksmen were standing guard. When they saw Kent coming over, they all bowed respectfully, "My lord." "Yes." Kent nodded. The castle in front of him was well planned. The roads and buildings were like a chessboard. They were clear and looked very pleasing to the eye. The military district, residential area, and crafts area were distributed reasonably, with a sense of symmetrical beauty. This was his castle. He turned to the Vigier marksman on guard and asked, "Did you find anything unusual?" "No, the castle is very peaceful." The other Vigier marksman quickly replied, "Everything is clear." "Very good." Kent smiled. "Stay alert." "Yes," the marksman answered firmly. Just as Kent continued to look at the other areas, a camel caravan made up of 20 camels came in from the east gate. The people around them moved aside and looked down from above. It was very eye-catching. "Manit is back." Kent understood and turned to walk towards the stairs. This time, Manit should be able to bring back a lot of good news, or bad news. After all, Kent had agreed to open up the trade caravan at the central post house. Any trade caravan could enter the post house to trade. There would definitely be a lot of noble families and merchants who would receive the news, as well as that Baron Dillon. Baron Dillon at the Stone Pass regarded Kent's Oasis lookout and salt mine as his exclusive property. Now that the post house trade was open, everyone could go and buy table salt. This would violate his profits. If he didn't make a move, Kent would never believe it, and Manit, who was trading and gathering information at the Stone Pass, would definitely bear the brunt. After all, everyone knew that this young man was actually Kent's business spokesman. He returned to the first floor of the council hall and sat in his lord's hall. Manit quickly walked in after arranging the camel caravan. "Thank you for your hard work." Kent was the first to speak. He smiled and welcomed him. "I'm very happy to see you back." "Thank you for your concern, Lord Kent." Manit stood still and bowed respectfully to Kent. "All right." However, Kent chuckled. He looked at the fatigue on Manit's face and said, "It seems that you must have encountered some difficulties at the Stone Pass. Normally, you wouldn't be so serious."